Engines on. 5, 4, 3, 2. Liftoff. We have liftoff with Apollo for the Apollo.
I was thinking about this particular show. The thing that sort of stands out about it is the absence of the art schools on the plaques next to the works. And there's the name of the artist, the title of the work, absence of the art school. So it kind of invites a reading, sort of a general reading, where either it could be about the general state of young art now or the state of art school art, or kind of could make you think a little bit about what constitutes MFA degree art at this point in time. And here again, I'm wondering, do you see any difference between artists that have an MFA or that have been through the whole process? Is there something specific about art that comes out of an art school? Is it more informed? Is it more rebellious?
Of course it is.
Yeah?
I mean, the idea that you could actually seriously do without an MFA, I think is implausible, personally. I think Jorge Pardo is the great example of that. Jorge doesn't have an MFA.
Who's the great example?
Jorge Pardo,
Oh, okay.
who simply learned the mechanisms of the art world, embraced them uncritically, and was of course successful, because if you do that, then how can you not immediately be a hit, because you're in the shadow of something with which you're not arguing. So people go to graduate school, and one way or another they take the skills that they've acquired and find something to do with them. I think the idea to do without graduate school is simply far-fetched, taking into account the difference between graduate schools as they say that.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I think it's great that there aren't labels that identify the people in this show with the schools they went to. I mean, the point is that they went to them. They're not going to them anymore. Some of them are, I know, but in general it's a show of graduates, isn't it? And so in this show we get to see people as individuals without first asking where they went to school. And I think actually the fact that it's not so easy to place people is encouraging. And so I only intervene here in this way. I know you weren't really talking to me, but there's this question of, do you recognize MFA art as such? I mean, that's such a Jerry Swartz kind of question, if I may say so.
Ouch.
It seems to me no, I don't recognize MFA art, but because I don't know whether people have an MFA or not when I see their work, but I think that in general the quality of work in any situation is going to be dependent at this point on whether people have enough years in school. I think that is the case. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think the question sort of gets to the heart of, it might be a difficult thing to discuss, but what it is that gets taught in schools. And again, I'm not bringing up these questions in a critical way, just to sort of open up a discussion on them. So I mentioned in 1953 already this kind of question came up of what do we teach in schools, once we move away from a sort of a craft-based vocational style of training, right, where drawing is at the basis of everything, and you have a set program of techniques to learn. What then becomes the kind of paradigm? And this man, Raymond Parker, in 1953, in an essay titled Student, Teacher, Artist, said, "Teachers demonstrate how they participate in the art world or discuss how others do it. The art world can be taught as a subject." And I think when you brought up Jorge Pardo, he did have a BFA, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he learned even there, and perhaps through his actual moving through the art world, learned the art world as a subject in this kind of instrumental way, let's say. But I think what you're talking about is that one can also learn the art world as a subject in a sort of a self-critical way, right? And that the works then would demonstrate a certain degree of at least uneasiness or outright criticality with regard to the field with which they're engaging, right? They would have a vexed relationship to it, or
maybe.
Yeah, I take it from the
again. When students come into my program, I tell them we want them to leave able to deal with French philosophers at one end and American shopkeepers, art dealers on the other. So you want to be able to deal with the world. But I don't teach them how to deal with the art world. I teach them, things they need to know about painting and aspects of philosophy which I'm competent to teach, and other people teach things they're competent to teach. And I hope in other graduate schools, too, people teach the things artists need to know. What they need to know about shopkeeping is, I think, something they should more or less find out for themselves. But I don't believe that the function of an art school, or of an artist for that matter, but artists can be variously defined, is to figure out a way to orientate oneself to a commercial system, or any other system of distribution, let me say, because it's also, I'll just interject this sort of truism. The world is not actually divided between art schools and art galleries with nothing else. People emerge into the world in varieties of ways, and that seems relevant here too. On criticality, Baldassare has been mentioned. He's my closest friend. We've known one another since 1971, and I've been taking the piss out of John for the last several years on this score. John is famous for the remark, if you see a rule, break it. And as I've been saying for years, that sounds terribly like a rule to me. And so on the question of do people learn criticality, that's the trouble. They don't learn to be critical of the orthodoxy of criticality. So we have lots of art which just goes through this pantomime of Oedipal relationships to precedent examples. And collectors like it because it organizes the world. But since that's a world that we analyzed and found out about since it was the world of the past, it cannot really be the world you're actually living in. So that's the sort of thing we really try to discuss in graduate schools, I hope.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and I think you're sort of, the pantomime you're talking about is a kind of pantomime of criticality directed outward, right, into the context. But there's also the potential of the work to be self-critical.
Supposing that work is interesting because it's the opposite of the work that was being done a generation before. That may be a way of reading 19th century art history. It therefore cannot be a way of figuring out what's going on now. That's the pantomime.
But one can teach the artist in a certain way to be self-critical, right? Or to produce works that sort of are self-critical, are the product of their own criticism. And I know that's a bit of a sort of Greenbergian notion, but I think it still applies because the question is, what do you teach in art school if it's not a particular skill? You teach a way of thinking, or you supply a number of options in terms of here's different ways you could think about what you do, right? But that turns it into more of a kind of a profession, or even a learned profession, than a like a métier, right? And what does that constitute? These various these various theories that what use do people put them to, if not to a certain kind of critical engagement with their own production, right?
Yeah, I don't think we should spend the evening discussing my philosophy of teaching. I'll summarize it in 3 sentences. I don't think we know how we got from 1970 to now. That's why I think it's preposterous to pretend that we do. I think that works of art are made by people who are, by definition, narcissistic and nuts, and that art doesn't come from nowhere, so there's always a point of origin or several points of origin within art and outside of it. But what's happened to it, because of who's got a hold of it, is something else. And so people have to be able to theorize what they're doing. Certainly they have to know some theory, to do some philosophy. But they have to be able to theorize what they're doing from a position which may be, by definition, uncertain, and won't be a matter of locating themselves within a fixed context. And I think people need to understand that the nature of change is that it's not always the same, and that we don't actually know what art is anymore, and that we have graduate schools -1, which can only work if we proceed from the notion that we don't actually know what it is we're teaching. That's my philosophy about education.
Well, I mean, on that point, I mean, Steve, you were talking about the artist as a kind of iconoclast. There's a certain amount of agreement, I think, in what you're saying, Jeremy, right? There's a certain kind of agreement in that sense. But then again, the art school is typically sort of formulated as a space where, a certain sort of set of rules, perhaps, or codes, or languages, or discourses, or practices are taught to a large group of people, right? So there is necessarily a degree of conformity there, even if the conformity is sort of an avant-garde conformity about breaking the rules, right, as you're saying.
Well, I don't know. I mean, again, I don't want to hog the conversation, but I think the way you have an interesting graduate school is that you assemble as many people who are good at what they do, which means they have public reputations, blah, 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 and who violently disagree with one another. And that's a faculty. And if possible, they disagree with one another in front of the students, and that will demystify the notion of mastery and authority. And that is a situation in which people will, by default, and also because they're being implicitly encouraged, to think for themselves. And that is, of course, you mentioned self-criticality. Well, that's what self-criticality means. It means think of yourself. So it's hard for me to locate an implicit conformism in such a structure. I wouldn't know. I don't think it is conformist. I think there may have been a time. I graduated from art school in 1970. There may well have been a time when there was great pressure on people in art schools to conform to the dominant style. But I think, although one could certainly find examples of that, I think in general the difficulty of identifying a dominant style has begun to erode that, even in places where people would want to preserve it. So in general, I think you're not doing badly when it comes to conformism in graduate education at the moment.
Yeah, I'm going to throw in another quote. This is, again, from a time where perhaps conformism was more evident. This is Lane Relier writing about the present and writing about pluralism in relationship to, again, the sort of post-war period, as he puts it, when all painters walked around with the same cognitive maps in their heads, and they all agreed on what the issues were concerning surface or process or color or shape or edge. Clearly at that point, there was such a thing as the medium's specific, and there was like the idea of the dominant medium. And this again brings up the question of how do you conduct a discussion of art in a kind of pluralistic moment, or a moment where you acknowledge there's no dominant medium, there's no dominant ideology. We're kind of shuttling between a notion of the art school as center and the, let's say, the art world, the gallery world as center. How do you kind of discuss, how do you kind of conduct a discussion of art, or how do you sort of evolve a discourse of art? Because the conformity I'm talking about is simply that you kind of pass on a language, right, to the students of a certain kind of self-criticality, and it has to be understood to some extent between those students and between the larger art world, right? There still has to be some sort of a language. But what does it consist of, is what I'm wondering at this point. if anyone has a thought.
I didn't go to art school, and I don't teach at art school, so I can't say anything about that. But I would say, one thought I have as we hear the conversation, it keeps school, gallery. There's a whole bunch of other important players in this thing. There's the consumer, and there's several kinds of consumers. There's the collector, there's the nonprofit space, there's the opinion giver, the judge, the critic. So, there's art that only appeals in the nonprofit venue, that's only shown there, and they have no career in the commercial sense, but they get monies to participate. There are certain artists who will get reviewed in Art Forum repeatedly, and that's one of their universes. So there's no easy way to draw a big generality between and just keep galleries at one end and art schools the other. There's all these other players in it, and everyone gets their vote. Some people get more than one vote. And some people get, just like a fraction of a vote. But there's a whole bunch of factors involved between the gallery and I don't think the galleries have the most power in this. But I mean, they have a certain amount. But it's a confluence of many things that kind of yield a result or a place in the art world. So just not just gallery and school.
So you're saying everyone gets a vote, so it's the public that decides that?
No, I don't think the public, it's like, art's like the only market that I understand really, that I can think of, where it's really paid for by just a few people. In other words, you can go to any gallery for free, and it exists because a few people bought some work, and it's free for everybody else. Like, it doesn't work that way at a concert. Everyone buys their ticket, in museums, everyone buys their ticket. It's not like, there's just a few benefactors and everyone gets to go for free. I mean, sometimes it does, but it's really a very odd market, an odd system in the way that it's supported. So, no, I don't think the public gets much vote, really. I think that, there's the MoCA show that just ended, the Art in the Streets. I mean, there was a lot of traffic at that show, a lot of people, so they voted, but they're not going to have much influence over which artists are going to get another showing or are going to have a career. So, I mean, certain people have big votes, the ones who spend, a lot of money, and they can affect things like, Saatchi or Ravel or people like that have pretty big votes. They have, they're like Texas or something. It's a big state versus Rhode Island or something. The votes are not. It's not. There's no electoral college, or actually maybe there is an electoral college, and big states, big voters get to influence the outcome. But it's a very odd system, the way it's supported. I can't think of another market system that functions the way the art world does. Can you?
Well, I think Art in the Streets was a good example of, there you can certainly make a kind of distinction between different parts of the art world, right? And different audiences and different publics.
Look, there's, just look at the auctions, I mean, there's a number of departments. There's a contemporary department, there's the modern and contemporary department, there's the Chinese market, there's the American market, there's the photography department, and they overlap sometimes, and then there's the furniture market, and if you're Jorge Pardo, you could be in any number of them. So, we like to divide things up neatly, but in the end, it's where the divisions are very blurry that it's the most interesting. So, I don't think that it's going to be very satisfying to, have a set of rules that works for your way of thinking. Because just when you think you understand it, you hope, anyway, to find the exception that, takes you in a whole new way. At least that's what I hope for. I don't think there's like a clear path. I think what I think today will be, gone, in a year in terms of what's interesting and whatnot. I'll still like different things, but I mean, it's the journey and the path of seeing new things and new ideas that reflect new generations and new times. I mean, it's just a much different world today than it was, 20 years ago and 40 and so forth. And that's what makes it interesting as a viewer, and it's hard to make a blanket statement about it.